Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to talk today about poverty, based mostly on my own first-hand experience of growing up really poor in America, and how a characteristic of poverty might help to explain why we Unitarian Universalists are often more appealing to an affluent, white, college-educated demographic more than any other. Several months after I was born, my dad left us, and we didn't hear from him again for decades. My brothers were almost 10 and 11 years old at the time, and my Hispanic mother, who only had a high school education and no work experience, suddenly had to support all four of us. She would apply for entry-level filing jobs, and she would be offered those jobs, but at half the pay of the men who were already in those positions. 50% was a common pay rate for women starting in World War II and going all the way into the 1970s. This is how bad the pay disparity was for women when I was a little kid, between men and women. When my older brother was in high school in 1975, he got a job washing dishes at a local hospital at night. His paycheck for that part-time job was exactly equal to my mom's paycheck for full-time secretarial work. Wow. Which means that for years up to that point, the four of us had been living on the equivalent of one high school boy's part-time pay. That was my mom's income, and it's what the four of us had to get by on. The overriding sentiment in society at this time was not, we need to pay women fairly so that they don't have to apply for government assistance. And we were certainly on food stamps at this time. The overriding sentiment that even I was aware of at a very young age was, we need to get these lazy welfare mothers off the dole. It was barely practical for my mom to work the one full-time job that she had, much less get a second job. As it was, I was home alone by myself for huge chunks of the day. From the age of 7 onward, I was home by myself, especially during summer vacations from school, from the time I got up in the morning until my mom got home from work in the evenings. She used to let me stay up really late during summers so that I would be asleep when she went to work, because if I was awake, sometimes I wouldn't let her leave. I would just beg her not to leave me home alone. Most people, I think, can imagine the technical difficulties of being really poor, like how to pay for childcare or the rent. But I feel like most people don't realize how humiliating poverty can be. Nobody likes asking for help with the basics, like food. It's not the same thing as asking for a ride to the airport, for example. How many times have you ever heard Joys and Concerns where somebody proudly declared that they had received a welfare check that week? It's not because there's nobody in our congregations that's on government assistance. It's because they don't want anyone to know. We lived in a weird situation where my mother was skipping meals so that my brothers and I would have enough to eat, but I was taking music lessons. My grandma, my dad's mom, paid for these lessons, but she lived hundreds of miles away in Northern California, so she wasn't there to see how bad things were. And my mom was too ashamed to tell her, so she spent the music lessons money on lessons instead of on food. I didn't even realize that we were all that poor until I got to junior high school, basically. And then kids started making fun of my clothes. We had always bought my clothes 2 or 3 sizes too big so that I would grow into them and they'd last longer. So at the beginning of any school year, I always had these big floppy clown clothes, and then by the end of the school year they fit, but they were shabby. But I thought everyone struggled with money because that was so normal for us. When my mom was skipping meals, we would ask her, why aren't you eating dinner? And she would lie to us, and she'd say, oh, we had a potluck again today at work. And she'd make up all the different food that she'd been eating that day. I can't tell you how it irks me to see poverty romanticized in modern media, especially when I see women of color portrayed as working themselves to death to get their kids educated and support their families, and everyone pulls together because more than anything, they all really love each other. And of course, the whole thing has a happy ending, right? The reality, my reality, was that my brothers and I argued and fought constantly. That might sound normal for 3 brothers, but in our case, all we did was fight. There were not good or neutral things mixed in with the fighting. Looking back on it, all of our arguments and our physical fights at their roots were really about lack of resources. Food, clothes, money, bedroom space, closet space, our mother's attention, everything was always in short supply, always. We didn't pull together for anything. We competed for everything. A child's first words are typically a variation of mommy or daddy. My first 2 words were no and mine. My entire childhood, our financial situation got a tiny bit worse every year, mostly because housing kept getting more expensive faster than our income was growing. When I was in kindergarten, we lived in a rundown 2-bedroom house in a decent area. We moved around a lot as the cheap houses that we rented were sold out from under us and the new owners wanted to live there themselves. By the time I was 10 years old, we had moved 8 separate times. Also, by the time I was 10, we could no longer afford houses, only apartments. I graduated from junior high school, and I had a summer off, and then at 14, I started high school and I started working to help support myself that same week. Because of my age, I was legally restricted to not more than 32 hours a week, so the equivalent of 4 full-time days. A decade earlier, my older brothers did not have to start working until they were just about old enough to start college, not just to graduate junior high school. This was the Reagan years. This was the time in America when the enormous gap that we have today between the very wealthy and the very poor, this is when it began, in my opinion. It didn't happen overnight, but I want to highlight some of this. There are a lot of jobs today that fall into the minimum wage category that were not minimum wage jobs back then. My brother washing dishes at a hospital at night is a good example of that. My mom was paid minimum wage because she was a woman. But her teenage son, the dishwasher, and also busboys and line chefs and childcare workers and ambulance drivers and tax preparers and lifeguards, there were numerous professions that used to be paid significantly more than the bare minimum wage required by law. Previous to the 1980s, CEOs of major companies made dozens of times more money than their workers made, not thousands of times more money. Corporations like Chevron used to actually pay taxes, and nobody would have ever dreamed that one day corporations would legally be considered people. Legions of the severely mentally ill did not roam the streets of Los Angeles as homeless people. I never, ever saw a homeless person until the 1980s, and then suddenly there were thousands of them, and today it just seems normal. Previous to the 1980s, only one partner in a marriage had to work in order for that family to enjoy what we called the American dream. They didn't live extravagantly, and it had to be the husband. But even at that, a white guy, working full-time at a department store could make enough money to support himself and a wife and 2.1 children and save enough money to buy a house. Today, both partners in a marriage working full-time and still not being able to save enough money to buy even a small condo, because that's become the new normal. But I digress. When I started high school, my brothers had already moved out on their own, but by that time, all my mom and I could afford for just the two of us now was a one-bedroom apartment in a crummy neighborhood. When I was 5 years old, we had a house with a yard and a decent area. Just 10 years later, with her income almost doubled at this point, this crummy one-bedroom apartment in the same city took the majority of my mom's paycheck. All you ever heard from the government and the media at this time was, we've cut taxes on the rich and incomes are on the rise. And incomes were on the rise, but that was only a good thing if your rising incomes was a good thing if you had a mortgage, if you were a homeowner, because your monthly expenses were fixed for the next 2 or 3 decades by the mortgage. Not if you were a home renter and your monthly expenses continued to decline every year. My mom took the bedroom of this one-bedroom apartment, and my little twin bed was in the living room / kitchen across from the couch. And then one of my brothers moved back in with us, and he slept on the couch. All through high school, this is how I lived, with the 3 of us in this one-bedroom apartment. For a very private, introverted teenage boy like me, it was awful. We lived in the bad part of Alhambra. When I was a little kid, we lived in the good part of Alhambra, and then we slowly moved our way across town. Alhambra, then and now, has on one of its borders East LA, where you can have multiple families living in one apartment. And on its far opposite border is San Marino, where the homes cost millions of dollars. Alhambra is the economically gray area in between the two. My high school was grades 9 through 12. It had over 3,000 students, and it was a mix of poor and well-off kids, depending on what part of Alhambra they lived in. That was good for kids like me, because I got to see what was possible. The stereotype of poor people living in bad or dangerous neighborhoods where everyone around you is also poor, that's often true. But there are a lot of struggling people who don't fit the stereotype of what many believe poor is. I confronted a lot of stereotypes when I was growing up. The one that really stands out in my mind the most is that if you were poor, it was your fault. You had done something foolish to get yourself into a bad situation. When I was 16 years old and working at Sears until 11 o'clock at night, and nodding off in my high school classes the next day, I would hear politicians, or sometimes teachers, and especially the well-off kids or their parents, express this particular belief in one way or another. If you're poor, it's your fault. And I was so tired, and I was so envious of the kids who had 2 parents, and who didn't have to work, and who had bedrooms, and who got allowances and whatever else. And I would be stocking shelves late at night at Sears, and I would think to myself, how is this my fault? This is how a liberal is made, by the way, at least in my case. Most of my friends were clueless about money. But whether they were given brand new cars because they turned 16 and they had trust funds waiting to pay for their college education, or if they had no car, shared a bedroom, and they took out student loans to pay for their college education, they were all just expected to go to college and get good jobs and have prosperous lives. That's how that lifestyle, the one that I live today, that's how it was modeled for me through friends and their families at school, or even casual acquaintances at school. Another assumption about poor people that I encounter even today is that due to public education, everyone pretty much has the same chance. If you work hard in school and you apply yourself, your opportunities are pretty much the same as kids from well-off families, which is total BS. At my high school, it really is. At my high school, if your parents had a university degree, you were okay because your parents made sure that you went to college. Otherwise, you were kind of out of luck. There were only two things of any importance at my economically mixed high school: attendance, because that's how the school got paid by the government, and no tank tops for boys. Those are the only two things that were ever stressed by the administration. The Dean of Girls instituted the no tank tops for boys rule. She didn't want to see hairy armpits, so she banned tank tops for boys unless they shaved. Seriously. At least 2,000 students at this school, including me, had no idea what an SAT was, and we never took that test. We'd heard about SATs, but we didn't know what they were for or when to take them. But we all knew about attendance, and we all knew about no tank tops. Even bordering affluent areas with a mix of students from well-off college-educated homes, this is the state of education in the economically mixed area where I went to high school. Can you imagine what it's like for schools where the entire surrounding community is poor? I don't think I would have had any model at all for what was possible if I had grown up in an entirely poor area instead of the very mixed one that I did. Just after graduating from high school, I moved out on my own and I never went back. I had several false starts going to college, and I didn't finish undergrad until I was 30. At 19, I had a job at a bank. I did really well there. I promoted quickly. I got what I thought were good raises. And I worked there for years. And then I hit the educational glass ceiling, and I couldn't go any further without a bachelor's degree. So I decided to go back to school full-time and only work part-time, and I would just rent a room somewhere instead of renting a whole apartment like I had done for years. My entire family was horrified. There was no support of any kind for my getting a university degree. I was making $24,000 a year at the time. My mom's parents were easily the best off financially of everyone in the family. They were retired. They had a small, very nice home in a great neighborhood just south of Pasadena on a gigantic lot. It was almost an acre. And they had paid a whopping $11,000 for the whole thing back in the 1940s. Right. So my walking away from a job that every year paid more than twice what that house cost was unthinkable to everyone in the family. It didn't matter that I was not making anywhere near even the median income for California at that time. My mom's parents were in a good financial situation despite the fact that they had gotten married when they were 17 years old and they had kids right away. My grandfather was a Mexican immigrant who barely spoke English, and they ended up having to raise not only their own kids, but some of my grandmother's youngest siblings, because my grandmother was the oldest of 8 children. And when she was 21, her mom died, and a bunch of the kids moved in with them. So they all had the odds stacked against them. Fortunately, my mom's dad was a boxer, and he won a Golden Gloves fight. In the late 1940s, minimum wage was 40 cents an hour, and my grandfather won $5,000, which for him was more than 6 years of income all at once. It was a life-changing amount of money. My grandmother literally plucked the prize money out of his eager, happy hands and said, "Dame eso, compramos una casa," which means, "Give me that, we're buying a house." That's how they escaped poverty. The house that they bought for $11,000 decades later was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. You can't do that anymore, but you could then, if somehow you had the money to begin with. That one Golden Gloves fight changed their entire lives. I am no longer poor today, but being poor in childhood shaped my prosperous adult life in some strange ways. For example, we could never afford doctors when I was a kid, so we didn't go unless things were extremely bad. I still have trouble with one of my ears today from an infection that ran out of control when I was 6 or 7 years old. In fact, it's bothering me right now. As an adult, even though I had really great health insurance that was 100% paid for by my employer, I didn't go to the doctor no matter how sick I was until I was in my 30s. And then that first time in my 30s, only because my husband called the doctor's office pretending to be me and made the appointment. When your spouse is the same gender, they can do stuff like that. When I first, I have no idea. When I first moved out on my own, when I was 18, I moved into my own small studio apartment, and I lived alone. For years, I wasted so much money on rent. Most of my paycheck went to rent, but I didn't want roommates. Most of my life, I had shared a bedroom, and after that last 4 years of high school, with my mom and my brother in that tiny apartment and relatives constantly visiting, I needed privacy, and I needed quiet, and I was willing to pay for it. The money that I made in high school was a piddly amount that went entirely to food or clothes or any kind of school expense. As I got into my 20s, and I made a lot more money, and I blew most of it on rent, I continued to spend everything I made because all I had ever known since birth was living paycheck to paycheck. I had several little epiphanies about myself and my family as I was writing this for today. The hardest one was about my mom. I love my mom, but her retirement plan was that she was going to win the lottery. She was absolutely, unequivocally convinced she was going to win the lottery. At the end of her life, due to cancer healthcare costs, she ended up being an extreme financial burden on me and my husband and my oldest brother. My mom was a smart woman. So this whole lottery thing was one of the most frustrating aspects of our relationship, especially as she was dying. And I was facing the certainty of losing my mom and at the same time, potentially, the financial ruin of myself and my husband and my oldest brother. As I was putting this together for today, I was reading it out loud to myself, and I realized it was that damn Golden Gloves fight that my grandfather had won. My mom's whole life, she was waiting for that one-time, life-changing financial event to happen for her, the way that it had happened for her parents. My mom made a lot of mistakes when I was a kid. She made a lot of financial mistakes. I made a lot of financial mistakes the first several years that I was completely on my own, like not finishing undergrad until I was 30. But I have to tell you, most of that is only obvious now, in hindsight. I assure you that if my mistakes had been more obvious while I was making them, I would have done things differently. And I have to believe that that's true of most poor people. It really annoys me to hear poor people being ridiculed for things like buying flat-screen TVs instead of investing in college bonds for their kids. That kind of disapproval often comes from people who have never been really poor, looking at those in poverty and thinking through what they would do if they found themselves in similar circumstances. Here's the thing. Suddenly finding yourself in financial distress is not at all the same thing as always having been poor. I've been on both sides of that fence. You are aware of so many more options when you at one time had those options, even if they're not currently available to you. If I lost everything I had right now, I would do better financially over the next 5 or 6 years than I did the first 30 years of my whole life. When I was a kid, any high school boy working part-time in his very first job could make as much money as my mom in her 40s working a full-time job, and people blamed my mom for not making enough and her need to use food stamps. Today, Labor Day weekend 2013, things have changed a lot. I think they've gotten worse. Today we have women and men working full-time jobs in America who, despite their full-time employment, still qualify for government assistance because they're making so little money. As a society, we're not pointing to the CEOs of these companies and saying, you need to take a few million less in compensation each year and pay your employees a wage that they can live on so that our taxes are not used to subsidize your company's wage expense with food stamps. The purpose of the food stamp program is not so that corporations can pay their employees less money and thereby be more profitable. But that's what it's turned into. What we are doing typically as a society is we look at the poor people and we say, I work really hard for everything that I have. Why should I be taxed to pay for your family's food stamps? If you're not making enough to support yourself, you need to get a second job. If you're poor, it's your fault. It's all still completely upside down. So what might be a connection between being really poor and this affluent, white, university-educated demographic that seems to have stranglehold on so many of our congregations, despite the fact that we are truly welcoming people to everyone who walks in our doors? Back in the 1970s, when my mom was making half, she was being paid half of what her male coworkers made, she tried UU churches, and she did not find them appealing. And she was very UU in a lot of her thinking. She produced me. I can't ask her now why we were not more attractive to her, but I can make a couple of really good guesses. When just about every single day you are not sure if you're going to be able to feed your kids or pay your rent, when you're actually expecting notice that says you have to move because the house you're living in has been sold. When you are poor, life is full of ambiguity and uncertainty. Life is ambiguous and uncertain enough for a lot of people, maybe for most people, regardless of their financial condition. I believe that some folks end up going to some of these very rigid black and white view of the world churches for the distinct lack of ambiguity that those churches offer. And they sit through sermons that are much longer than ours and that are filled with very definitive statements. This is right, period. That is wrong, period. Certainty is comforting. Certainty is comforting, especially when everything else in your life is a coin toss. How many UU services have you been to that offered a rigid black and white view of the world? That's just not us. In my opinion, my Hispanic mother was not attracted to us more for socioeconomic reasons rather than purely ethnicity. But the two are closely linked when you consider that poverty rates in America can be more than twice as high for marginalized people. I don't think that we UUs need to become more rigid or definitive in our Sunday services. I do believe that we need to recognize that there are large demographics of people who want to come to church, not just looking for comfort, but looking for comfort in the service they're expected to sit through. I hadn't really thought about it in that way until I was writing this for today. I don't often find comfort in UU services. It's the people and the activities connected with church where I get my contentment. You may find comfort in a service about a famous Unitarian Universalist like Susan B. Anthony or Charles Darwin. But most people who are not already UU, like most of our visitors, probably don't. I think that if we're going to grow and be at all relevant, our Sunday services are going to have to attempt to be as comforting as they are informative. They're going to have to speak to people's emotional side more than they typically do now. Don't you think that just about anyone can find a little or a lot of comfort in a UU congregation? The thing is, we need to let visitors feel that as soon and as much as possible so that they keep coming back often enough to discover the many ways that they fit in and how a UU community can enhance their lives. The very first time that I walked into what is now my UU church in conservative Orange County, California, I did not feel like I had a whole lot in common with the heterosexual parents running around after their kids, or the single folks checking each other out, or the engineers or the PhDs that we seem to have in abundance in UU congregations. But I kept going back, and I became a member there. I even ended up on the board for 3 years. And it all started for two simple reasons. The people there were nice to me, and the people there showed an interest in my life. They didn't just feel welcoming in their own hearts and minds, they acted welcoming toward strangers like me and my husband. With my background, what hooked me into being a Unitarian Universalist was almost entirely emotional, not intellectual. As a faith community, we've got the intellectual stuff handled. Nobody questions and debates everything like Unitarian Universalists. It's the emotional stuff where I think we can sometimes fall a little bit short. So I will leave you today with this challenge. How do we develop that emotional quality? If that's what's missing from our Sunday services, and certain large demographics of people are also missing from our Sunday services, maybe there's a connection. Thank you for listening to me today. I am very grateful for all of you and your presence in and your participation in my life.